Apologies. I'm now unmuted. After 18 months after the pandemic, I still can't use the technology. But good morning, good afternoon, in fact, now. My name is Daniel Thomas, Chief Business Correspondent at Financial Times, and welcome to this webinar on business rates, organised by the Westminster Property Association and the New West End Company. There is a lot to talk about here following the budget and the spending review last month. Rishi Sunak delivered a proper body blow to company bosses from retail and property to manufacturing, who have long argued for a fundamental reform of the business rate system, a property tax that's not been revalued since 2015. This feels an awfully long time ago, and property values have changed vastly given the shifting nature of the high street, as well as more recently the impacts of the pandemic, and these factors are clearly still playing out. The Chancellor gave some tweaks here and there, as we know, around green improvements notably, but crucially not the overhaul or replacement of business rates that many wanted. It was not through lack of trying by companies. The retail and property sectors especially were heard loud and clear in the Treasury, but were largely ignored. Now business leaders are warning that the archaic and unsustainable system risks holding back the recovery from the pandemic and exacerbating growing inequality between England's richest and poorest areas. It's been estimated that a quarter of shops now pay each year more in rates than they do in rent, and many of these businesses are located in areas of the northern England that the government has committed to level up, as we know. But all is not lost. Treasury sources have already told me that this could be back on the table come the spring and the next budget, so efforts to persuade officials need to be redoubled, even if the task of replacing a £31 billion windfall tax for the Treasury is going to be incredibly difficult. However, ministers are going to consult on plans for an online sales tax, which will go alongside business rates and could level some of the playing field somewhat between the online and bricks and mortar worlds. Again, there are merits and drawbacks to another tax on the retail sector through such fundamental changes. And again, much to ask our fantastic panel today. So let's crack on with the session. I'd like to remind you all that we will have some time for Q&A at the end, so please do submit questions via the Q&A box on the right-hand side of the screen, and I'll put them to our expert panelists. And with that, I will introduce our speakers. We have Matthew Green, who's Cabinet Member for Business Licensing and Planning at Westminster City Council. We have Vivienne King, Chair of the Shopkeepers Campaign. But to start us off and to give us a sense of where we are in the world, we have Professor Tony Travers from the London School of Economics, who will put this issue into context and try to explain some of the complexities and options before he also joins the panel and faces your questions. So with that, Tony, over to you. Please take us away.
Okay, Dan, and other panel members and audience members, welcome and hello to everybody. What I will do is just spend 5 minutes, I've got a watch here to remind myself of that, just explaining how we got here really and what the options might be moving forward. It's worth remembering that the non-domestic rate, which is a very long evolved tax that goes back into the mists of time, has actually been quite significantly criticised by official reports about taxation. The Layfield Committee, which is an official committee back in the 1970s, was critical about business rates. More recently, the Merleys Committee, which the Institute for Fiscal Studies oversaw, was pretty critical of it too. And in the middle of the, between Layfield and Merleys, came the nationalisation of the business rate, creating a comprehensibility issue, which Westminster Council in particular, where billions are collected in business rates, but only a tiny proportion of that is retained, has this particular problem that often people think all the money that's collected in Westminster or Camden or the city is held there and spent there, which it isn't. So there's that really significant issue. There's been a number of reviews of business rates by the Treasury in recent years, all of which lead to the same conclusion, which is we need a few more reliefs, but other than that, we carry on with it. Intriguingly, at the Labour Party conference this year, the Shadow Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, actually announced that Labour would abolish business rates. And that led to some criticism from the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak. And the criticism was particularly about how would you replace this 25 to 30 billion pounds if you got rid of business rates. Now, this is something that the Westminster Property Association has looked at before in reports, a report that I was involved with Alexander Jan. And what we did then was to say, well, if you were to consider replacing business rates, what kind of taxes might you replace them with? Well, you might, given the criticisms of the way business rates work, particularly for retail businesses, as retail has been changing in recent years, you might replace them with a sales tax, a local sales tax of the kind that you meet in many American states and cities. A bit complicated alongside value-added tax. You might have a higher rate of value-added tax. Might have an online sales tax. All of these things have been looked at and discussed, not only in our report but elsewhere. Possibly a capital value tax if you want to stick with some sort of property tax. Now, of course, the difficulty with all these reforms is A, all tax reforms are difficult because they produce gainers and losers, and B, certainly if you moved away from a tax which is in any sense a property tax, there would be windfall gains for property owners, and also implications, well, and actually losses for others, and then implications for councils, because property taxes, even though national non-domestic rate isn't quite a local tax, there is some retention in it. But if you get rid of property taxes, very hard to imagine really a local value-added tax, I think, when you've got a national value-added tax system. So there are implications for local government as well. Now, the pandemic, as with many aspects of public policy, produced a massive test for business rates, what with retailers having to close, the hospitality industry having to close, transport, leisure and so on. So there were massive reliefs paid out, which of course, because of the high rate payments in central London authorities got most of that repayment, so that businesses paid little or no business rates during the period of the pandemic. And interestingly, in the budget, the Chancellor announced 50% reliefs for a period for those leisure, recreation and hospitality businesses, although subject to a limit, which of course many central London businesses, I suspect, will hit quite quickly. There were other things in the budget: freeze on the multiplier, a sort of short-term rebate on extra business rates paid if you improve your property. But actually, the simple message from the budget is non-domestic rates are here to stay. I mean, that is the message of the review. Looking forward, there'll be a revaluation taking place in 2023 on the basis of 2021, i.e. this year's evidence about rentals. Thereafter, the government when it's been committed for some time now, for a 3-year cycle of revaluations. I think there'll be quite a substantial redistribution of the business rate base on the basis of values taken in 2021. And I'm not sure politics has worked out what that will be yet, but it seems quite likely that central London, which pays a very substantial share of the business rates in England, will probably end up, their businesses there will pay somewhat less, and that will mean places elsewhere, including in the Midlands and the North, paying rather more. And I don't think that sounds quite like levelling up, even though it might be fair in terms of the way the system's operating, particularly given the pressures on central London's economy as we move out of, slowly, the pandemic. Last but not least, I did mention earlier that business rates, remember, they were initially and originally a local tax source, nationalised in 1990 when the community charge poll tax was introduced. But even now there is some retention, which is important to local government as a revenue source. But it's intriguing to hear Michael Gove saying the other day in a select committee that he doesn't think it's possible to go much further with business rate retention because some places would gain more than others, and that makes it difficult in terms of equalisation. So why does this matter? Well, coming back to Westminster, we're going to hear it from Westminster in a moment. Westminster pays over £2 billion a year, or was paying, or businesses in Westminster, I should say, are paying over £2 billion a year, and Camden and the city also with very high, and Tower Hamlets, very high payments. But very little of that money is spent in the area in central London, in Westminster and other London boroughs, a point which I think many people quite understandably don't fully understand. So there's a perception issue there too. So just to conclude, according to this government party, the Conservatives, business rates are here to stay, but with more reliefs and some recognition that they are a stress on businesses, particularly smaller ones. Labour committed to abolishing them. Labour isn't in office, so that's for the future. And I think, therefore, for today's debate, a lot to discuss in terms of the impact of this particular tax on the central London economy, the West End economy, as it recovers and as it reshapes itself post-pandemic and post all the other stresses and strains on retail because of Brexit and so on. Dan, thank you.
Well, fantastic, Tony. Indeed, we've got the two people to answer that exact point. But before I do come to them, I'd like to just come back to your point about business rates being here to stay. Do you think that's now the clear message from Treasury? Because I got a sense from talking to people in and around the department after the budget came out, after spending review came out, that actually they could come back to this in the spring. They weren't ready to do it now, but they could come back and maybe do something a bit more fundamental then. Do you think it's totally off the agenda now? It's off the table as something they could produce a fundamental reform to?
Well, I do think it's off the agenda because A, they've had several reviews in recent years which always come back to the same conclusion. B, without being unkind to the government, they have lots of reviews running and they all take a very long time and often the results are not that exciting. Sorry. And then last but not least, almost any reform would leave central London paying less and the rest of the country paying more, assuming the total is the same, because the nature of business rates and their being based on rentals means central London pays a very, very much larger amount than it would with almost any other tax you can imagine. So redistributing the burden of non-domestic taxation away from central London to the rest of the country doesn't sound like modern politics. So I think probably business rates are here for the foreseeable future. And by the way, the government said the other day in a response to a select committee, council tax isn't going to be reformed either, absolutely clearly.
Yeah, clearly it doesn't play very well in the blue wall, I suppose. So this is the changes that we saw in the budget are effectively what we should now come to expect in the medium term. And this is their fundamental reform, to be very clear.
Well, actually, and it's building on years of reform, not just the current Chancellor, because the government's response to business rates boils down to not just this government, but its predecessors, is that they're not a perfect tax, and we realise that small businesses, they're very inflexible in relation to small businesses' turnover. So more and more and more, actually not so much small as low rateable value businesses, not the same as small, low rateable value businesses, and now some sectors temporarily, and then improvements. There's all sorts of small reliefs, but if you look at the sum total of the reliefs that the Chancellor discussed the other day, they're carefully added up over 3 or 4 years into big numbers. The actual amount in any one year is, and certainly apart from this first year, 22-23, when I think it's £2 or so billion, isn't very much in the years running forward. So it's effectively exempting more and more low rateable value businesses over time, and they're leaving all the bigger ratepayers, many of them in central London, paying more and more of the bill. That seems to be the direction of change. Yeah.
As you say, the exemptions were basically meant that you had more than one store, you're in trouble. But Vivienne, let's come to you first, just to respond to what Tony was saying. I mean, what was your takeaway from the budget? I mean, were you disappointed, and what were the signs that you took out to be optimistic about, perhaps?
Okay, thank you, Dan, and thanks, Tony. Always really good to hear what you have to say. So so I chair the Shopkeepers Campaign. We've been running for over a year, and our objective is to reduce business rates for retail, because that's what government said in their manifesto that they would be doing. So we've been arguing for what that manifesto pledge amounted to. We've got some very clear objectives. One is to reduce the UBR for retail. Another is to do away with downward phasing. Another is to accelerate revaluations so they are annual, and then that actually reflects the market. And then also that empty rates relief should actually reflect the period of voids that are being experienced in the marketplace. Retail, well, that's because retail has faced the most disproportionate rise in business rates in any other sector since 2001. It's gone up 87%, whereas rents have gone up 16%. The two are supposed to correlate. Clearly, they don't. And frequently, as we've already mentioned, rates are actually higher than rent being paid. And this is really badly felt in the North and the Midlands, where downward phasing has been such a penalty, but it is felt everywhere. The campaign has been operating at a grassroots level, so we are engaging with politicians, we are engaging with retailers, we're out there talking to bids, we're talking to local authorities, we are travelling around the country talking to everybody to understand what business rates means to them. And the consistent message that we're always getting is, despite the changes taking place in retail property, despite the fact people are moving online, all of that, we can cope with all of that, we just can't cope with business rates. So it's a very, very simple, very clear message that business rates simply aren't working. Now, the Chancellor said it would be irresponsible to do away with business rates altogether. We haven't been advocating for a non-property tax. We recognise that a property tax is sensible. It's just that what we want to see is a tax that's fair, that's appropriately set, that reflects the reality of this century's retailing. That's what we've been arguing for. So a tax that's set at 51% is exorbitant in anybody's terms, and we certainly see that, and it's payable irrespective of the ability to pay. So it's simply payable for being. Now, we recognise that that's what a property tax does, but as I say, we are supportive of property tax so long as it's set fairly and it reflects current markets. So the changes in the budget, well, we've had a fundamental review running. So fundamental reform was what we had in mind. Fundamental reform wasn't what we got. What we got was some changes that were dressed up as major concessions, but as Tony has said, that's not what they were. We were talking about tweaks here to a system that's fundamentally unsound. I've gone back, and I know Tony has too. This is actually Elizabethan, not current Elizabeth, the first one. So I think it's high time for reform to be had. We didn't get fundamental reform this time, but I'm probably not quite as pessimistic as Tony, because I'm looking at the consultations that are intended, and we've obviously had a reduction in the gap between revaluations, not annual, which is what we need and what we've been arguing for, but it's a step in the right direction. And there is a vague hint in the final report that increasing the revaluation periods is something that could be considered. So, okay. Empty rates are going to be looked at. That's because they think the government thinks that there's abuse of empty rates. Well, we don't think there is an abuse of the empty rates relief, but it's an opportunity to look at it. And then in talking about online as a possible alternative, government has said in the report that if an online tax were to be introduced, it could be used to reduce business rates. So I would say that there is hope out there, that there's certainly everything to play for. And that's the objective of the Shopkeepers Campaign.
Fascinating stuff. Vivienne, just I mean, to take all those, as you say, relatively minor concessions in reality in the round. I mean, I mean, if that is it, if that is what the government's going to do, I mean, what impact does that have on the retail sector?
Well, it's very little for large retailers. Very little, virtually nothing. I mean, the 50% retail, hospitality, leisure reduction over the 1 year because of the cap for some of the large flagships in Westminster, it's not even going to cover one store. It doesn't come anywhere near it. So for a number of operators, it's really not going to make an awful lot of difference. And we've done a sort of broad brush calculation that if you've got sort of an average retailer with say 50 stores around the country, they might see 0.5% difference in their business rates bill. So we're talking about something really quite negligible. It's played out as something so much more. Well, it would be because this is politics. But the reality is that the pain continues, and even for those who are able to benefit from the 50% reduction, it is only for 1 year. Businesses business plan for more than 1 year ahead. They need to have certainty for the long term. So short-term temporary reliefs really don't help them.
Yeah. Well, Matthew, so Vivienne's described it as negligible as an impact on central London retail. I mean, what was your takeaway from the Chancellor's speech and his concessions?
Well, I think Tony said that the pandemic has been a test for business rates. I think we can all agree that this has been a test that they have completely failed. And what we saw in the budget is, as Vivienne said, it's not a fundamental reform of business rates, which is absolutely what we need in order to improve or to replace this failing tax. And I think, we need to put it in the context of Westminster. Westminster's not only traditionally been the goose that laid the golden eggs for the Treasury in terms of NNDR, but it also, because of the pandemic, has been one of the hardest hit areas in the country. Oxford Street has been the hardest hit major retail centre in the world, and Westminster has been hardest hit by the pandemic of any local authority in the country, I think with the exception of the City of London. So we've seen a quarter or a third of businesses forecasting a loss in 2021, and 50% of all our businesses have had to make use of the furlough scheme. Vivienne was obviously right to talk about retail, but hospitality certainly has been in particular hardest hit, pubs and bars in particular. We did a survey in June, and there were only 14% of pubs and bars that felt that they had a high confidence of survival over the next 3 months. Now, we've started to see footfall come back, and I hope that that's improved. But in central London, we're still down a third, and in parts of Westminster, for example, the west part of Oxford Street, we haven't really gone back over 50% of the footfall that we had in 2019. This is placing significant strain on hospitality and retail, alongside other huge challenges, such as the issues that they currently face with Brexit. We've seen only 1 in 10 international tourists come back into the centre of our city. So, of course, what was announced in the budget, we welcome. The multiplier freeze, the revaluation process reform, but obviously Vivienne's right that this needs to be every year and not 3 years. Although we do need to look actually potentially, given the loss given property values having dipped post-pandemic, maybe locking in a 3-year period for our businesses might be advantageous, and also the reliefs for investment, sustainability, that those are welcome. But I didn't mean to be ungracious, but it really is small beer compared with the burden that is faced, and that different burden between bricks and mortar and online retailers. And I think I'm going to put my cards firmly on the table, and that our position remains that we need the swift introduction of an online sales tax. And this isn't about being parochial, it's about securing a fair and level playing field. The tax burdens are considerably higher for physical shops than online. So the Altus group this year found that Amazon had a tax to turnover ratio of 0.37%. And for bricks and mortar retailers, it's as high as 2.3%. So the difference is vast. And it's the bricks and mortar retailers that are facing the slowdown. And they're the ones that are recovering more slowly because of the pandemic. And I said I wasn't going to be parochial, but this is a WPA and New West End Company event, so I can be Westminster centric. The 50% retail, 50% relief, it'll be beneficial to our small businesses, and I'm obviously grateful for that. But the cap, £110,000 means for relief, so total rates of 220k. That means that the only 10% of Westminster's businesses will benefit from the relief. And so some stores as large as Selfridges, so Vivienne said it wouldn't cover one store, it won't cover 1% of their rates. So they're not getting a 50% reduction in their business rates, they're getting a 1%. And it's important to say, Tony said low rateable value is not the same as being small. It's also important to say the high rateable value is not the same as being big, or certainly not the same as being wealthy. So that the assumption that these are big rich companies that can just stomach this level of taxation is absolutely wrong. So Vivienne is absolutely right. These are minor reforms and they will not have a meaningful and sustainable change. And it's the sustainability that's really important. As Vivienne said, the businesses plan 3 years in advance. So it's not the kind of change we need to the majority of Westminster's retail and hospitality. And those are the very businesses that are in most need of our support. Bricks and mortar was in decline before the pandemic, and that's why, you know, the only way we can get these businesses through the twin crises of the pandemic and Brexit, the other challenges such as staffing, is with that online sales tax. And this is the only way that will level the playing field between online and physical. And so we're welcome that the consultation has been launched, and we will be telling the government that the most effective way to support our high streets is an online sales tax that will need to derive its income from online retailers who do not pay business rates, such as Amazon. And this needs to reduce the burden of business rates on those with physical property. So we want the government not only to introduce the tax, but to do it swiftly. And that's why it's so disappointed that we went to consultation rather than an immediate introduction of this tax. And we have to realise that a phased or a long introduction of an online sales tax, it could end up just being too little, too late for many of the businesses that are already struggling.
Well, and we haven't actually seen the detail of the consultation yet either, so give me some. We don't know the timing of it really, but I mean, another thing Vivienne said was that, you know, and I think Tony alluded to this as well, is the politics of it, and that it feels like this government is a government which is very mindful of votes and where the votes are. I mean, do you feel like your voice, you know, from Westminster is being heard within central government when you come to them and say to them, this is, as you say, really, this could absolutely penalise the businesses in our area. Do they listen to that, or are they just absolutely led by the blue wall, red wall, whatever you want to call them, votes up north, and the feeling that, you know, this is a levelling up exercise in practice?
Well, I'm a boy from Bolton, so I don't have any particular objection to the levelling up agenda, and I think it is really important. But I think we have to realise that we cannot have a UK-wide recovery without a London recovery, and the role that London plays in the entirety of the country's economy, it cannot be discounted. And Westminster, as the capital of the capital, as I said, the golden goose that is laying the NNDR eggs for the Treasury, we do need that level of support. And I can't imagine that the government will not listen to what we're saying. But I think that Tony's right, and this is a political process, and it's one that's going to be slow to change. I think if we're talking about this being something from the first Elizabethan age, perhaps to have got the level of reform that we got in the latest budget is we could chalk up to being a massive success. I don't know, and I hope we won't have to wait for Elizabeth III before we actually do end up with a genuine transition to a more level playing field. But I mean, I think that what we will need to do is we'll need to speak as an all Westminster and probably an all London voice on this one, and that's why it's really important to have these conversations with the WPA and with the new West End company. And I think that by coming together and making our case, that's the best way that we can get the government to listen to us.
Yeah, indeed. I'll come back to you in a bit. Vivienne, Tony, actually Tony first. I'm going to come to you about the online sales tax because Matthew laid out, a very strong case for an online sales tax. I'd love to hear your views on it in more depth, whether or not you're supportive of it, because in the retail world, it's not 100% in favour of an online sales tax. Clearly, there's lots of big retailers who shudder at the thought of it, outside Amazon as well. So I'd love to get your views, but just to remind the audience that we will take live Q&A. I am by no means the best questioner out there. I'm sure other people have got questions as well. So please do send in your thoughts and we can put them to our panel. But first of all, Tony, what's your, from your way you're sitting from the kind of, macro, from the economic view of things, does an online sales tax work in this country?
Well, we don't know yet because we've not tried one, and the difficulty with taxing or indeed regulating, we know there's a broader public policy issue. The difference with taxing or regulating large, often global, very powerful multinational companies is that the UK government is in some ways weaker than the company. That's part of the problem, or some of the companies anyway, and the government's afraid of losing investment in Britain if they treat new media type businesses, including online retailers, too aggressively. So there's that sort of bigger problem, and it's not unique to retail in Britain, that unless the whole world moves, rather like the decision which seems to have gone relatively easily around the world to try to stop a race to the bottom with corporation tax, you've got to make sure that countries broadly move online consistently, and that would be true, I think, of an online sales tax. But if it was to replace business rates, as I implied earlier, I mean, if it was simply, it would of course significantly redistribute the burden away from bricks and mortar retailers and onto online retailers. I think most people would think that was fairer. Matthew made the point about the extraordinary way in which, put this carefully, it's a public meeting, online retailers appear to manage their affairs so efficiently compared with those operating with shop windows and nice displays at Christmas. I think there's two different issues here. One is the nature of what business rates does to creativity and to retail, given we all want high streets, including Oxford Street and Regent Street, to flourish. So there's that issue. It's not a good tax in terms of the burden it puts on bricks and mortar retail. And then there's the separate issue, which is, would an online sales tax be fairer as a way of raising money? Almost certainly it would. But as I say, the government is, I think, very wary about moving far in that direction quickly. At least it would appear so far, though they are looking further at it, in fairness. Yeah,
is it even possible under the OECD tax agreement? I mean,
I don't know. I'm not an expert on OECD tax rules. Vivienne may.
Potentially, but it's certainly maybe in the short term anyway. But Vivienne, I mean, when you talk to your members, I mean, are they pro, against? Are they, cause there must be some mixed messages coming through from the retail scene.
Yes, there are, but there are a significant number who are pro, even though they recognise that they take advantage of online. They still would be supportive of it. So I think if you look at where the levelling up is needed, basically you're talking about online sales are, say, 25–30% of all sales, but business rates payable by online is about 6%. And so but then when you look at how much of business rates paid by retail, it's about 25%, but their contribution to GDP is about 10%. So there's something gone wrong with the numbers there. That the balancing does need to be done, and we did some preliminary research last year on how online could work. And our UBR that we're arguing for is a 30%, 30p base UBR. And we calculated that would roughly amount to about £3 billion loss for government. And we recognise that the loss needs to be made up somehow. Absolutely. It's just that the way it needs to be made up, we would say, is through distributing it through a broader array of taxes. And so that loss could be covered by about a 3% online tax. So we're just talking about retail here. Retail is the sector that's being hardest hit, and so that's how we would see it. Now, we did suggest that to government in one of our responses in the consultation process. We didn't suggest it as the only option. We think that there's a number of different options that the government should be looking at, and probably you want to be thinking about a suite of alternatives to compensate for a reduction in business rates. And of course, we do have to take into account that it's complicated, not least because retail is so dominantly omni-channel now. So it's not as simply what you can't have is a case where you take it away from one retailer through business rates, but then they have to pay exactly the same amount through their online platforms. That's unhelpful, and it's not dissimilar to what property owners in the retail sector are thinking about at the moment, as we're trying to unravel turnover rents, how a turnover rent is going to work, and it's not simply a case of putting a mechanism on the till anymore and taking a percentage of what goes through the till, because so much business is done online but can be attributed to a particular store. It is complicated, and there's a real need to understand how online works for retailers in order for this to be done well. So there does need to be a strong retail response to the consultation. Recognise that there are those issues with it, but it does have the potential for levelling up. It does have the potential for releasing capital for investment in those assets, not least green investment. It does have the potential for ensuring that those who take advantage of local services are actually paying for them, not least the waste that online creates in a domestic environment. Oh, we just lost Dan. And I think another point to bear in mind is we're conscious of the fact that there is an oversupply of retail space in our town centres. There's a lot of talk about conversion to residential. If we had all of our retail convert to residential, which we won't, then there's going to be a loss in the tax take anyway.
Can I just chip in on that, Vivienne? Because in referring to something Matthew said, if the government, I mean, I don't think the government's thought this through at all, because you're absolutely right. You know, particularly in central London, there will be small restaurants paying £40,000 or £50,000 a year in business rate, and round the corner, vast house paying £1,700, or at most, depending which borough they're in, £3,500. Beyond that, referring to the point Matthew made, if business rates stay very high for businesses in central London, then truth is their rents will fall, because rents and rates work together. And as the rents fall, so will their rateable value, and so will the government's yield. And given from business rates, and you know, if a central London business rate, which was I think 15% of the England total, somebody will correct me in the chat if I've got that wrong. If that fell, let's say this policy of levelling down, let's go for it, call it that, worked, and there was a big drop in central London rentals, and then business rates fell down, then businesses all over the rest of the country will have to pay more. So I just don't think they've thought this through at all. And it's you know, I don't know, be unkind, but I don't think, I can only assume that the Treasury is thinking that central London's economy will definitely recover. Therefore, they can allow businesses like Selfridges to end up with these very high rate payments, where other businesses in most of the rest of the country pay little or half what they'd otherwise pay. And I just don't think that's thought through at all.
I think that's where the online sales tax has to come in. You know, in 2019, Amazon, and I promise I'm not just picking on Amazon, they paid 64 million in business rates. Debenhams paid 80 million. And where's Debenhams now?
Exactly. That shop won't be paying much business rate this year, will it?
Well, but the point.
Owner will, Tony.
But the
will the owner still be paying?
Well, it's in development now, I believe, so
Yeah.
it won't be paying business rates. But anyway, but you know, the sales of Amazon compared to the sales of Debenhams, it's incomparable virtually. But it was Debenhams that was paying around 20% more in business rates. So I think that we can see the take from business rates in central London go down if that's balanced out by levelling the playing field with this online sales tax. And I know it's going to be complicated, and I understand why Vivienne's members are not necessarily full-throatedly or as full-throatedly in support of it as I am, because we've seen the rise of click and collect, and we've seen how a lot of businesses, most businesses, I think with the exception of Primark on the high street, have moved into that online space. And clearly Vivienne's right that it can't be robbing from Peter to pay Paul, in terms of that they get a reduction on their business rates and then clouted with a tax on everything that they do in terms of online. So clearly we have to carve out exceptions for bricks and clicks, or ensure that they are taxed at a different rate from the pure online retailers that are not paying the same amount in business rates. So I think you can see the take from central London go down if there's a concomitant balance from those online businesses not paying more than they should do, but paying their fair share.
And Matthew, I mean, to the point of you know, being a local authority, a council, I mean, you rely upon this money, don't you? I mean, you get £2 billion through the rate system. I mean, so you presumably don't want them to fall too much. You want this money to come through the door, which pays for the street lamps and so on. And so, I mean, as a council, where does this money go?
But of course, it is important that we receive that money back. But you know, I forget the percentage, but whatever the percentage of zero is zero. So what we cannot have is a situation where we see our high streets turn into Hoover towns, where you have empty units that are generating no business rates for the council. So it's a balance. You know, Westminster is home to I think between different estimates between 1 in 8 and the West End, sorry, is home to between 1 in 8 and 1 in 10 London jobs. You know, 40% of Westminster residents who work in Westminster. So we need to be able to retain the retail and the 80,000 hospitality jobs that we have. I mean, that's why we as a council, we were in terms of the alfresco scheme that we introduced during the pandemic, where we created 17,000 extra covers across the city. That was so important in supporting that industry that is so vital to Westminster. So I think that that seeing the take go down, and who knows, we need to see what the online sales tax is going to do, because there's an argument to be made that some of that should be coming back to local government as well. Vivienne's right. You know, we are collecting the boxes and the parcels. It is also affecting our air quality in terms of the number of freight deliveries that we have across our city. So there's an argument to be made that if this doesn't damage the Treasury, if it's revenue neutral for the Treasury, it should be revenue neutral for local authorities as well.
Yeah, and I think just commenting on the amount that Westminster collects, which quite understandably, most businesses, certainly smaller businesses that are still paying it, will think is money the council gets and spends. Well, actually, overwhelmingly, the money paid in business rates in Westminster is used by the National Exchequer to pay for services elsewhere in the country. So the amount retained by Westminster, again, somebody will correct me if I got this wrong, I think of the 2.2 billion is about 4% in a normal year. So the extraordinary nature in which central government, this would be unimaginable in any other city in the world, that all the business rate is collected and then distributed elsewhere. Now, it's true Westminster gets some recognition through what used to be a grant system for its higher needs, but this is a very strange and complicated way of doing it. And I think it makes comprehension virtually impossible.
Yeah. And Vivienne, I mean, looking at the revaluations, as we're discussing right at the top of the the hour. I mean, what impact will that have? You know, the more frequent revaluations on the retail sector, and specifically, there's a question we've come from the audience, and we're coming to the questions now from you guys. So thanks so much for sending them through. But it's one of the risks associated with more frequent valuations that transitional relief means that taxpayers in London will never really see bills fall. And that's from Alexander at the London Property Alliance.
Yeah, so well, the revaluation cycle isn't just a London issue, of course. It's across the board, and as I said, we were looking for annual revaluations because rents and rates are supposed to be connected. They're supposed to follow each other. They have become decoupled, clearly. But putting them back through an annual system would improve things. Actually, this movement is more frequent than that, but it would certainly improve things. So that's one aspect of where we need to see change. And I think in London you probably see more volatility. Matthew will be able to correct me, but there's probably more volatility in London, and therefore there needs to be a closer alignment between rates and rateable value and rental value. So that's one aspect of it. And then in relation to transitional relief, yes, absolutely. In other parts of the country, in Scotland, for instance, changes through the revaluation process are put in place immediately. Why can't we do that? Why can't we do that in England? The idea is that it's supposed to enable businesses to adjust to the changes. That the transitional relief arrangements are written into legislation, but unfortunately also written into legislation is what's effectively fiscal neutrality. So although there might be adjustments, at the end of the day, government has to end up in the same position. It's a bit like a seesaw that you might drop in one place, but you rise in another, and at the end of the day, it's got to be a straight line. So that's particularly difficult where you do have downward phasing. Because the catch-up is just such a slow process, because the transitional arrangement means that the change happens over a period of time and it's capped. So yes, anywhere where there's been a significant drop in values is going to experience a materially unfair outcome, and that could very well be the outcome that's experienced in 2023. Yeah.
Matthew, do you have any thoughts on this? In the revaluation coming up in a couple of minutes.
As I said, I think we need. We kind of the proof of the pudding will be in the eating on this one. If we end up with rents being a kind of hockey stick shaped curve, where they go down and they go back up again, it may be that locking in the lower rates for 3 years could be beneficial to our businesses. I think what we do, I just think the Valuation Office Agency needs a shake up in its entirety. One of the things that we've certainly seen in the obviously when where grants were being issued on the basis of NNDR rates, we saw businesses that had entirely incorrect valuations, and trying to get them the correct valuation, a valuation that would allow them to receive a grant over the last 18 months. That was a very slow, almost glacial process. So I do think that there just needs to be a general shake-up of the VOA, and just to make it more responsive to businesses, because at the moment it is a bit like wading through treacle.
I think the government has made a bit more money available in the budget for the VOA, so there is a line in the budget for that. But it ought to be possible, given the sophistication of the property industry in London and the surveying industry in London and across the country, actually, to deliver annual revaluations. We managed to do it with income tax for people who don't pay, who are self-employed. So if we can do it for income tax for individuals, I just don't see why it can't be done for a much smaller number of businesses. What's happened to big data?
Well, yeah, GovTech needs to be brought into bear. But Vivienne, it's also a question from our audience as well around the VOA and the need for investment in it. I mean, as Tony says, there was some money allocated, but it wouldn't appear anywhere near enough to really get to grips with a department which has such power but such criticism against it.
Yeah, it's coming from quite a long way back, isn't it, Dan? I think that the thing that needs to be attended to in the VOA, and alongside resourcing and skills and digitalisation, just to bring it up to current practice, really. I mean, I've spoken to a number of the big agents in London, and they've all said we could do it. So why can't they? But I think also there needs to be a cultural shift in the VOA. There needs to be a greater willingness for transparency. That will help the sort of comprehensibility of the system, but greater transparency and greater speed. They need to be more nimble in the way they do things, and that isn't simply through putting in the right tech or bringing in the right number of people or the right number of skills. It actually needs a cultural change as well.
Matthew, a question here, I think, which is partly to you, but you can ask others as well. Around the, this is more about the kind of the future of the West End's retail offering, I suppose, to some degree, and it does feed into the rates debate. But I mean, the question is, landlords are being pushed to sign leases with kiss me quick type tenants, which offer nothing to the Westminster offer. I think this is basically you're down Oxford Street, as you mentioned earlier, and people will be very mindful they're seeing sweet shops and other things which perhaps isn't synonymous with the kind of the premium end of West End retail that we expect. We're around Selfridges and so on, and at the same time we're seeing the department stores, the anchor stores, closing down for various reasons, and others opening, to be fair. But what's your, just to take it a step back, what's your kind of vision of Oxford Street and the Westminster retail vision, as it were, and how does the sort of money side feed into it?
Well, look, I'm obviously sympathetic to landlords, who sings for the songbird type of thing, and I realise that they need to make a return on their incredibly hefty investments, especially in central London. But obviously, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily call them kiss me quick. They're more of a punch in the face in terms of what they're doing for certainly the west end of Oxford Street, which is looking somewhat tawdry with its luggage shops and sweet shops. But I realise that people need to make a living. I mean, I think this allows me to put in a plug for the Westminster's Voids activation scheme, where we've been working with empty units, and we've been putting in artists, we've been putting in retail pop-ups. As there's around 40 people on the call, I'll put in a plug for 88 Regent Street, which is our sustainable pop-up, where we're working with 6 young fashion designers who are all sustainable. They're making clothes out of eucalyptus leaves. They are recycling kimonos into streetwear. We're also about to launch another pop-up later this month at 500 Oxford Street, the former New Look store there. So I think that actually we're talking now about the changing nature of retail, and we all recognise that retail needs to be more experiential, that we need to recreate the FOMO, the fear of missing out that you get online, the fact that online is constantly changing. And I think that pop-ups are a solution here. The pop-up that we're doing in 500 Oxford Street will also have an artist downstairs. So again, bringing something that you just cannot get online. And I think that if businesses could work with young retailers and incubate them rather than going for a kiss me quick tenant, then they're not only matching they're not only matching what you get online, but they are also producing the next generation of occupiers. And I think that that's something, and retail had been slow to change. When I started this, I genuinely thought that it would be easy. It'd be just something that you could just flick a switch. But actually, retail, certainly in the West End, they've not had to work as hard as this in the past. There's been a certain amount of build it and they will come mentality. So the oil tanker needs to change, needs to turn. It needs to turn slightly faster than it's turning at the moment.
I mean, just to add to that, Dan. I mean, I'm struck by the fact that through my entire life in sort of looking at London and studying it and indeed living in it. Normally the east end of Oxford Street was the problematic end and the west end was always rather glamorous, and it has changed. It's for the first time I can ever remember, the east end is now actually in rather better state than the west end, which is a remarkable change, and the west end of Oxford Street definitely now needs love and attention. Perhaps a sugar tax would help. Only just a joke.
Well, yeah. I mean, it's great to see IKEA take that store, isn't it? On that note, but it's you know, whilst I was having me sitting next to the CEO of Selfridges the other day, he was telling me about the skateboard ramp he's got on the first floor, and the to your point about experiences and the need for retailers to have different offerings, and he was saying the phenomenally successful Santa's Grotto they always have in Selfridges too. So clearly there's a lot to be, you know, a lot on offer there already, but you know, the future, and I'm kind of unfortunately have to conclude now because we're coming to the end of our time, but the future clearly is going to be dependent on people making money. Property taxes are a very easy, very simple way for the government to generate cash. They're, you know, they're easy to collect, they're difficult to avoid, they're hugely generative. So the government's not going to give up on this money anytime soon. So perhaps the way forward is some sort of, you know, a hybrid online offline tax. Perhaps they won't get their head around the online tax. Perhaps they'll be listening to Amazon rather than someone else. So who knows? I mean, one of the questions that came in from the audience actually we didn't come to is who's advising the government? Is there any point lobbying them anymore? You know, there's clear frustrations out there around this subject, and will continue to rumble. I hear perhaps more optimistic sort of noises from Treasury around the springtime than Tony and others. You know, who's to say they might come back to it? The review is over, but the battle perhaps is far from being so. So it's just up to me to thank my panelists, my fantastic panelists. Matthew, thank you so much. Vivienne, thank you so much. Tony, as always, brilliant to have you. And thank you as my audience as well for joining us today. Hopefully we'll do it next time in person. These things are great, but I do enjoy the in-person stuff more. So fantastic. Thanks again for joining us, and thanks again to the organisers, and have a great afternoon. Cheers, bye.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.